I'm Andreas Enfeldt from dietdoctor.com, and I'm here with Jeffry Gerber, who's a family physician with a lot of experience using low-carb diets for patients. Is that true?
Yes, Andreas. I wanted to just start by thanking you so much for inviting me. We're half a world apart from each other, but yet we're so similar in many ways. The funny part is that you're the diet doctor, and I'm the Denver diet doctor.
So we're very similar.
Well, the name was just a coincidence.
In name.
In name, but what I've realized after meeting with you and knowing you for the last couple years is that as physicians, early on in our training, we both realized that there was something wrong with nutrition. And we made it a part on our own to self-educate and to figure out what was wrong with nutrition. And now we've made it a mission to help our patients and help our communities to understand what's wrong with nutrition and why it's upside down.
So what is wrong with nutrition, and how did you figure this out?
Well, it actually started with my patients back in the 90s. And they had come to me and said, Dr. Gerber, there's some new diet books out there that are telling us that there's problems with dietary carbohydrates and that we need to reduce carbohydrates in our diet and increase saturated fat. And like most mainstream physicians, the typical response was that it's unhealthy, you might lose weight, but it also might have adverse health effects. But I supported them. I said, okay, so let's see what happens. And so we monitored the patients, and much to my surprise, their metabolic markers improved. Things such as lipids, their cardiac CRP, they lost weight, they felt great. And I said, okay, something is unusual here. This is supposed to not be healthy, but yet it is. So I began to investigate.
Right. So you were taught to believe that if you ate less carbs and more fat, your cholesterol would go up and give you heart disease, right? Precisely. And that's not what tended to happen?
That is, the exact opposite has happened.
So it was your patients who kind of made you interested in different ways of...
It started with patients. I had some family members. I had some personal experience with trying to restrict carbohydrates in my diet and had some success with that as well. And so we started to read more about it, to try to understand what was going on, and perhaps that there was something wrong with nutrition in the first place. Mm-hmm. And to understand that, we really have to go back to the 1950s and understand where our nutritional guidelines came from. And basically, it was, unfortunately, from some very weak science. And there's some basic principles that are so near and dear to us. These fundamental principles of nutrition. The first being the lipid hypothesis, that the notion that saturated fat was somehow unhealthy for us and would lead to heart attack, stroke, and therefore the recommendation is that we should avoid saturated fat in the diet, and we should replace it with polyunsaturated fats and our carbohydrates. The second scientific principle is that of energy balance, that if we eat fat, we're going to get fat, so we should avoid eating caloric dense foods such as fat, and again substitute it with carbohydrates and or proteins. So, and also that we should eat less and exercise more. Again, this is the first law of thermodynamics. And the problem with the first law is it's a very simple law that doesn't quite explain metabolism. And when we talk about metabolism, we're talking about a complex human biologic system involving hormones such as insulin, leptin, ghrelin, PYY, And it's these hormones that determine why we get fat and why we're hungry.
So this thinking that it's just about eating less and running a bit more is too simple? Simplified?
Much too simple. And if that combined with this idea that saturated fat is somehow unhealthy for us, essentially became the official USDA dietary guidelines 1978 with McGovern Committee, and then the official guidelines in 1980 that have since been, they report every 5 years, they update it, and to be honest, it really hasn't changed much. But basically since 1980, we see a major problem, an epidemic. The obesity rates have doubled in adults and tripled in children in the last 30 years. And you're quite familiar with this. You talk about that in your lecture quite often. And so some have actually called the federal guidelines one of the greatest human experiments of all time. And I think the experiment has run its course over the last 30 years, and we've clearly demonstrated that it's not working.
So what's the big mistake in it? What should we do differently?
Well, the big mistake is that they did not consider metabolism in their model. And what we understand today is that it really is these hormones, such as insulin and leptin, that regulate energy balance in our body. And you have to look at the macronutrients that drive these hormones. And all macronutrients are not created the same. And the simple fuel known as dietary carbohydrates are the primary fuel that drive insulin and drive these hormones. And a little bit of insulin is a good thing. A lot of it is a terrible thing. And when you bombard your body over a lifetime with dietary carbohydrates, it's going to wreak havoc on your metabolism. And that is really the problem.
And in America today, and of course many other countries, there's a lot of carbohydrates around, right?
There's way too many carbohydrates. And not only are there way too many, they are refined and processed. And so we really have to look at these federal guidelines. But the second problem is the food industry, what they've done to these federal guidelines. And the guidelines said, okay, well, we want you to eat more carbohydrates. Well, the food industry discovered that they could make their food more profitable by refining and processing it. Now, it serves a purpose. There's a lot of people to feed in our country and around the world, but they did not consider the adverse health effects by refining and processing these foods. What happens when you refine and process foods? They further wreak havoc on metabolism. Plus, they also take out the essential micronutrients from these foods. So they're basically empty calories. They're driving insulin, and they're causing obesity, diabetes, and all these diseases in modern society that we treat today. We refer to them as chronic diseases, such as atherosclerosis, heart attack, stroke, and again, type 2 diabetes and obesity, ultimately caused by these federal guidelines that are telling us to eat more carbohydrates in our diet and reduce saturated fat. And unfortunately, these guidelines are causing the diseases that we were trying to prevent in the first place.
So that's quite a big disaster with these health advice that are inadvertently making people obese and sick.
I would call it epic, an epic disaster. I cannot believe within our lifetimes that we're seeing this happen. And I think it's our job as healthcare professionals to educate everybody. Unfortunately, those usual suspects that work for the federal government, that work for the food industry, aren't going to steer away from their guidelines. And it's us outsiders that need to make the change.
But you got quite a lot of experience trying to help patients eat in a better way. What kind of results do you see?
So we've been treating patients on what you refer to as low carb, high fat diets for over 10 years now. And the results are wonderful. Now, weight loss in general is challenging, but if you give patients the right tools, they have success. And it's wonderful to see patients come in, and in the first part of my career, we were again prescribing the traditional mainstream guidelines and not having much success. But now that we've switched over in the last 10 years and teach patients about nutrition as it should be, they tend to lose weight, their energy improves, their outlook improves. We reduce the number of medications or completely eliminate the medications, and we're reducing the risk for development of chronic disease.
Oh, that's great. So what kind of reactions do you get from other people in the medical community and other places?
So we get mixed reactions, and I have made it a point in the state of Colorado, where I live, to educate, to speak to the community when I'm not seeing patients, and especially to the healthcare community. And so I try to get invited out to hospitals, any type of healthcare facility, and to get healthcare professionals, especially physicians, in my audience, and to discuss nutrition. And some of them are open, some of them are not open, and had one experience recently where a cardiologist was attending my lecture, and I'm not sure how much he liked of the lecture, but he certainly didn't like the part when I was telling the audience that saturated fat was a good thing and that patients should eat more of it. And we got into an argument, and I ended up writing a 4-page letter to him after the lecture, showing him the evidence over the past 60 years that was very weak to support this supposed relationship between saturated fat in the diet and heart disease. And basically, the evidence is weak, or another way to say it, there is no causal relationship. In fact, when you look at metabolism, it's insulin driven by carbohydrates that drives inflammation. And it is inflammation that causes heart disease. It's not cholesterol. And when we look at these metabolic pathways that cause inflammation, we realize that it's carbohydrates. Saturated fat, when you consume saturated fat, or any fat for that matter in the diet, it doesn't do much to insulin. It is not the inflammatory macronutrient. As well, protein isn't the inflammatory macronutrient as well. So we provide that evidence. Further evidence, we've now done some head-to-head studies comparing traditional low-fat diets to low-carb, high-fat diets. And in virtually all of these studies, as you're familiar with, they demonstrate that patients have a greater and sustained weight loss on low-carb, high-fat diets, and more importantly, their cardiometabolic markers. Again, their cardiometabolic markers improve on these low-carb, high-fat diets. And we present this information to the cardiologists, and they still struggle with it.
It takes time to change.
Yes. Well, the other point that the cardiologists will discuss is that we have outcome data, Dr. Gerber, 20 to 30 years, looking at these hard endpoints such as death from heart attack and heart attack, suggesting that there is this causal relationship. But we've looked at the same studies, and again, there is no relationship. The data is weak.
Okay, yeah. So, do you see any change happening in the theories? I mean, do you see any change when it comes to how doctors, what kind of advice doctors and dietitians give to patients regarding nutrition? Do you think anything is happening, or are we doing the same thing?
There's definitely change, and unfortunately it's slow to come, but what I am finding is the further and further I go away from the urban centers, people seem to be more open to these new concepts in nutrition. Even talking to diabetic educators and registered dietitians, they're actually beginning to look at the new science out there, and that there may be a benefit to low-carb, high-fat diets, Paleolithic diets, and the likes.
Do you use advice to eat low-carb or to eat paleo diets, or a mix of both?
I'm so glad you asked that question. There seems to be a debate that these diets are somehow different, and what I'd like to believe is that some of the luminaries out there in nutrition these days will come to a consensus opinion as to what is healthy nutrition. And so in my office, the majority of people that I see are overweight and they already have medical problems. And the best way to restore their health is with low-carb, high-fat diets. And as patients lose weight, as their health is restored, they get closer to ideal body weight, we get them off medications. And then perhaps we can look at modifying the percent of macronutrients that they consume. And so the Paleolithic diet comes into play. Now, some of the concepts about Paleolithic are wonderful. The idea that we should eat clean, whole, unprocessed foods, that makes total sense, and especially when we look at the foods that we consume today in our country. So I basically see these types of nutritional recommendations as really going in the right direction, and I think we need to keep going in that direction.
Mm-hmm. So we're at the American Society of Bariatric Physician Conference in Denver, in your hometown. There's quite a lot of talk during the lectures here about low-carb diets for people with obesity, patients with obesity, diabetes, metabolic problems. That's perhaps a good sign?
It's exciting. I've been a member of the society for since 2005, 2006, and it's a great organization because they really want to address the root of chronic disease in our country, which is obesity. And when I first was a member of the society, there were varying opinions about what's healthy nutrition. And there still is today, but it's really going into a direction where the society is recognizing that there's a problem with refined and processed foods. There's a problem with carbohydrates. There's problems with manufactured vegetable oils, and that saturated fat may not be such a bad thing. And the consensus in this community that clearly is that the best way to help patients lose weight is probably with low-carb, high-fat diets. And it's wonderful that they're going in that direction.
That's great. You have a clinic here in Denver. You're known as Denver's diet doctor. What kind of patients seek help from you, and what can you help them with?
So often the patients that initially find me are looking for weight loss. We still have a traditional practice where patients will come to see us for other reasons, but most of it starts with weight loss, and they're seeking a solution. They're actually smarter than most of the physicians. They realize that the weight issue is the root of the problem. And so they come to us looking for answers. And our practice in Denver is unique because we embrace nutrition as a tool to improve patients' health. Yes, it will help them lose weight, but the emphasis is to point out how it's going to treat and prevent these chronic diseases. So we actually work with insurance companies to address chronic disease along with treating weight issues. And the patients understand this, and they love it because they don't want to be on medications. They realize that the medications or the procedures are really just Band-Aids. And again, it brings us back to the root of the problem, which is nutrition and weight.
So, do you see any special problems in your practice? People who have a hard time losing weight, improving their health, using low carb diets?
So again, it's losing weight is a challenge, and we work with every patient. The principles are basically the same. We quantitate their metabolic defect, and everybody's different. So we have some patients that are quite overweight that are rather severely insulin resistant, which is one of these metabolic conditions that we're addressing. We even have patients that are overweight that aren't particularly insulin resistant. In fact, they're more insulin sensitive. So we have to consider all those factors when we're tailoring a nutritional program, sometimes even considering medications to help them with their weight loss. So the programs are particularly tailored. Again, it's predominantly based on the science of insulin, telling us that a low-carb, high-fat diet is the direction that we should go. And in virtually every patient that has successful weight loss, cardiometabolic markers improve.
So what kind of improvements do you see in these health markers?
So lipid profiles improve. We see the ratio of triglycerides to HDL improve. If you see a ratio of less than 2, that is an indication of improved oxidative potential of cholesterol, improvement in insulin resistance, improvement of inflammation. And if you notice, I didn't mention total cholesterol and LDL. It needs to be factored in there, but there's less emphasis. It doesn't accurately measure inflammatory potential. The traditional total LDL cholesterol is becoming less important, and now we look at something called the Ldl particle size. And in virtually every patient that loses weight on a low-carb, high-fat diet, we see an improvement of the Ldl particle size to the fluffy, pattern A, buoyant numbers. We see cardiac CRP, we see hemoglobin A1C, we see blood sugars. Every single parameter that I measure in the office improves in all these patients. Now, unfortunately, we have some that fail for whatever reason. And a lot of times they just admit that I can't stick with a program, they have a hard time. And I think at that point we're really left with some of the traditional principles of using medication. I mean, that's what we do as physicians. So sometimes there's a role. So if we can't change the patient's lifestyle, then we have to rely on modern medicine, which actually keeps us alive. Now, I wouldn't tell you that nutritional guidelines are keeping us alive. They're actually making us sick. So we have to prescribe these medications to keep our patients going. But if we can have our patients embrace nutrition as a tool to improve their health, they don't need they don't need medicine, they don't need modern medicine, they don't need these procedures.
Just need old-fashioned, good, real food, unprocessed.
You said a mouthful, absolutely.
So that's what people should be pursuing as the #1 way to improve their health, do you think?
Yes, it's basically it's nutrition that we should be looking at, and unfortunately we're up against a big gorilla, the Department of Agriculture and federal government, and again, those of us most interested in patients' health who are outside of governmental bodies really have to consider that this should be a grassroots effort, that if we rile the masses, we get enough involved to make a statement, then perhaps they'll listen to us. I think the other thing that would be important is that we need to do more research. We need money. It takes millions and millions of dollars and years to look clinically, to look objectively at nutrition. Feeding trials are the most difficult experiments to perform, but that's what we have to do to convince the federal government, to convince the medical community. We need more head-to-head trials comparing diets and to demonstrate long-term benefits of low-carb, high-fat diets.
So there's a long way to go still?
Yes, there is. And it's unfortunate, but yet it tells us that we have to continue on our mission to spread the message of healthy nutrition.
And people who are interested in healthy nutrition, they don't have to wait for the USDA or other guidelines. They can, for example, go to your site, which is at denversdietdoctor.com, right? denversdietdoctor.com and also dietdoctor.com. Yeah, I know. Very, very similar. But you have some YouTube lectures and more information for people who are interested in hearing more about this?
Yes, I am. I've made it a point to publicize our views of nutrition online. We're in the process of updating our outdated website, but the information on there is present, up to date, and we talk about the federal government. We discuss the traditional guidelines and where it went wrong, and we discuss metabolism. We discuss the problem with dietary carbohydrates, and we discuss saturated fats and their what we refer to as natural fats, for instance, such as coconut oil, butter, cream, lard, animal fat, olive oil. They were healthy in the first place. There was never anything wrong with them. And we discussed the problem with these manufactured polyunsaturated vegetable oils, such as canola, corn oil, that they oxidize, they turn rancid. In a sense, they're one step away from trans fats. And again, there was never any problem with saturated fat or natural fats in the first place. So we discussed that on our website, and that's recently been updated, and we've had some very positive feedback from the updates that we've added to our website recently.
Yeah, so anybody who's interested in hearing more about this from Dr. Jeffry Gerber, you can go to denversdietdoctor.com. Thank you so much for allowing me to interview you.
It's always my pleasure.